How does he speak to us? Well, very rarely do the clouds part and the thunderous voice come booming down to us here on earth. Mostly he speaks to us in very ordinary ways. But every single day, God speaks to you and he speaks to me in three very clear, distinct voices. The first voice of God is the voice of legitimate need. The voice of legitimate need. You and I, human beings, we have legitimate needs in the four areas we've been speaking about: physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual. Physically, if you don't eat, you will die. You have a legitimate need for food. Physically, if you don't eat, you will die. You have a legitimate need for food. And we have legitimate needs in each of the four areas: physically, emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually. Who gave us this need to eat, this need to drink? Who gave us this legitimate need? God gave us this need. And so when we hear this need calling out to us, whose voice do we hear? We hear the voice of God. When we hear our legitimate needs, physically, emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually, calling out to us, we hear the voice of legitimate need. But most of us don't even have the foggiest idea what our legitimate needs are. Most of us don't even have the foggiest idea what our legitimate needs are, because our culture, our world, and our lives are almost completely focused on our illegitimate wants. We spend most of our time, most of our energy, focused and chasing our illegitimate wants. We think that if we can have more of these things that we want, that then we'll find happiness, that then we'll find peace in our hearts, in our lives. And so we chase, and we chase these illegitimate wants, all the time ignoring our legitimate needs, which are in fact the key to the balance and the happiness that we desire and that God desires for us. Illegitimate wants, illegitimate desires. Funny thing is, you never can get enough of what you don't really need. You never can get enough of what you don't really need. And we keep chasing these things that we have no need for. We keep filling our lives with these things that we have no need for. They're just the fruit of our illegitimate desires, of our illegitimate wants. And all the time, the voice of God calling out to us, gently, ever so gently, calling us to attend to our legitimate needs, physically, emotionally, intellectually, spiritually. Do you know what your legitimate needs are? Do you know what your legitimate needs are? Physically, emotionally, intellectually, spiritually. How do we discover what they are? Well, only by listening to that gentle voice within us. How do we discover that gentle voice again in our lives? Like we spoke about yesterday, only by stepping into the classroom of silence, becoming reconnected with ourselves and reconnected with our God. By stepping back from the hustle and bustle of life, the day-to-day drudgery of life, to become reconnected with ourselves, reconnected with our God, so that we can hear that voice of legitimate need in our lives. So we can begin to focus on our legitimate needs, so that we can begin to identify our legitimate needs, physically, emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually, so that we can begin to fulfill those legitimate needs in our lives and see the ways that God is calling us to fulfill those legitimate needs. God is always speaking to us, screaming at us so loud what he wants us to do and what he wants for us, we just won't listen. The first voice, the voice of legitimate need. The second voice, the voice of talent. We're all created individually, uniquely. We have many different needs and many different talents, many different gifts, many different abilities. Do you know what yours are? Do you know what your talents, your gifts, your abilities are? Are you using them in your life? Are you using them in your life? Because when we hear the voice of talent calling us forth, when we hear the voice of talent calling us forth, whose voice do we hear? The voice of God. Why? Because it is he that has given us these talents, these gifts, these abilities. God always calling out to us, always calling out to us. Second voice he uses to call us along the path. The second voice he uses to call us on the path to become the best version of ourselves. The voice of talent. And finally, the third voice of God is the voice of deepest desire. You have desires, I have desires. Some of them shallow, but part of the journey of the soul, part of the adventure of salvation, is working out what our desires are and going beyond the shallow desires in our lives and in our hearts to the deepest desires in our hearts. Because it is God that has placed those deepest desires in our hearts. Those deep, deep desires for good things were placed there by God to help us make the journey, to call us along the path, to help us become the best version of ourselves. Do you know what your deepest desires are? Do you know what your deepest desires are? For myself, every day at about lunchtime, I have a desire for 6 double chocolate donuts. It's not a particularly deep desire. It's not a particularly deep desire. But the only way for me to say no to that shallow desire is to have a deeper yes. Do you know what your deeper yeses are in your life? Do you have deeper yeses in your life? The only way to come to them, once again, is to step out of the crazy, noisy, busy world, to step into the classroom of silence, to get reconnected with yourself, reconnected with your God, to get a sense of who you are and what your deep desires are. Because those desires, placed there by God. Placed there by God. They are the keys, they are the map to this journey for you. The 3 voices of God, the voice of legitimate need, the voice of talent, and the voice of deepest desire. All designed to draw us along this path. All designed to draw us from the person we are today, strengths, weaknesses, faults, failings, flaws, defects, talents, abilities. All designed to draw us from the person we are today to the person we're capable of becoming, to the best version of ourselves.